Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 43. A Growing Frustration. Ruby had always loved her uncle, even as unreliable as he could be. It wasn't too unusual for the man to just appear out of nowhere and brighten her life for a while, whether that was by taking her and Jan on trips or just hanging around and telling them stories of his own adventures. It was always a rather fun time. It was also educational more often than not. While Jan had chosen to learn from their dad, Ruby had always loved Crow's weapon. She remembered sitting on the grass as a child watching him practice moves. The way he moved had always looked so graceful, like she was watching someone dance with a grim that was lashing out at everything around it. Needless to say that the second she turned 11, the age he had told her to wait until, she'd asked him to train her. It had been almost an entire year of nothing but practice. Of course, she had made sure to exercise plenty in the time leading up to that, but it had been so much more intense than she'd ever expected. With only a year to get her skill up to the level needed to enter Signal Academy, most days had consisted of 12-hour practice sessions that left her body feeling like it was on fire. The same moves had been practiced over and over again, studying every single position and movement she could. For every slip-up, she would receive a heavy blow to the head from the wooden scythe she'd been given to practice with, and each served as a painful reminder of just how dangerous such a weapon was. Not only to opponents, but to its wielder. Thankfully though, after a full year of painful training, the day of the signal test had arrived. She remembered standing there, only 12 years old, in front of 3 snarling Beowulfs. She remembered feeling nothing for them. No fear, no worry, no hesitation. In that moment, she released all the pent-up anger she had and held nothing back. Each slash she made was purposeful and precise, their limbs and shredded bodies falling to the floor one after another. And when everything had quietened, she'd passed with top marks and was given entry to the school. It was a little awkward after that. The other students had seen her test and were always nervous to fight her, but it was rare for Ruby to walk away the victor from those sparring matches. It wasn't that she couldn't muster the will to fight as she did in the test, but that she didn't want to. She hated the creatures of Grimm. They were the only thing she truly despised, but her fellow students had done nothing to her. In fact, they were all really nice, but she could never get past the worry they had first shown at the start of the year, the hint of fear that had been in the eyes of the first girl she had been pitted against in sparring class. She didn't want people to look at her with fear, she wanted them to smile. It had always been a feeling that her Uncle Crow tried to tell her to ignore, but she'd never gotten past it. As a result, her score had slowly fallen as she progressed through the years. While she still topped out her class in terms of combat ability against Grimm, she was constantly near the bottom of her sparring classes. However, with Crow in town again, he'd been less than subtle about continuing their training. In fact, at dinner the night before, he had ordered her food for her, a large bowl of plain pasta, and told her that she was to show him everything she had learned. It was very unlike him, since he usually just tried to get into a random fight to test her. So, the next morning, Ruby found herself on one of the many fields surrounding Beacon sparring against her uncle. It had been almost an hour, and the sounds of clashing metal filled her ear as she bobbed and weaved her way through her uncle's masterful slashes, vaguely aware that there were a few students who were interested enough to stop by and watch the display. "Are you ever gonna attack, kiddo?" Crow smiled as she dodged his attempt at another slash. "Don't need to if you can't hit me," she laughed gleefully in response. "But if you insist." As his blade came down again, she bounced out of the way and immediately used her semblance to rocket towards his chest. However, before she could make contact, his side spun around to protect himself. Knowing she would be caught before ever making contact, she split off some petals and let them continue as she altered her course. Just as they exploded and turned the area red, she zipped between his legs and spun around to strike him. Unfortunately, her foot caught a patch of grass that was still kind of wet, and she lost her balance a little, causing her strike to miss. Thankfully, she was able to get her balance just in time to raise her scythe to deflect the retaliation attempt, sparks flying around her as his sword scratched across Crescent Rose's handle. "Really shouldn't announce when you're about to attack," he said in his usual scratchy voice. "Normally I don't." She spun her scythe and fired a shot at the older man's leg. As predicted, he moved out of the way just in time. With him off balance, she allowed the momentum to carry the weapon in a smooth arc. Having gathered the motion she wanted, she pressed the advantage and stepped forward. Guiding it in smooth arcs around herself, she clashed with her uncle for a few seconds. Sparks and dirt flew around them as their weapons slammed into each other, but Ruby couldn't find an opening. No matter how much she tried, Crow's weapon, Harbinger, always came around just in time to block her. Even though she wasn't giving it her all, it was frustrating that she wasn't able to punch through his defense, especially since he was still in sword form. The sword wasn't even Crow's primary weapon, yet she still couldn't accomplish so much as a scratch. She had speed on her side, she had dexterity and reach. It should have been effortless. Yet it wasn't, and her frustration began to steadily grow with each deflection. However, as his sword came up once again, she felt the head of her scythe glance of the smooth metal and pulled the trigger. With the barrel pressed against the side of the weapon, and the amount of force her bullets output, Crow was flung backwards a few feet. However, before she could try to take advantage, he twisted mid and landed with a downward slash of his weapon, as the barrel either side of the blade lit up white. With the previous shot having broken her momentum, and the scythe still dragging her arm backwards, there was no way for her to dodge the beam of energy that tore towards her. The most she could do was twist crescent rows, so that the head took the brunt on the attack. Unfortunately, the force of it was enough to shove the weapon backwards even more, the blade crashing into her chest and hooking her. After being dragged backwards a couple of feet, she took a gasp of air. It had hurt like hell, but it was still better than taking a hit from something that would have surely ripped through the trees behind her. He'd never used that much force before. "Is this really all you've learned at Beacon?" he sighed, his voice having switched from uncle to teacher as he stood up and brushed off his gray coat. "How to hold back more." His words struck a chord with her. She knew that she could have broken through if she'd gone all out. But there were students watching. Friends. And he was her uncle. She didn't want to have any of them look at her like her old classmates had. Like she was vicious and dangerous. "And no," she stuttered in return. "I've learned a lot." "Really?" His pale red eyes darkened, and he flipped the switch on the handle of his sword, the weapon quickly unfolding into its scythe form. "'Cause all I see is that Oz made another mistake that will get someone killed." Those words hurt her deep. She knew her uncle supported her in everything she did, and that he was likely trying to spur her into action, but that specific thing had caused her issue for some time. Even with Ojban's speech about how she inspired people to be better, she still questioned if she was ready from time to time. After all, the Helk had been a strong reminder that she still had a ways to go. But she was getting better. Her grades were improving, her leadership seemed to be getting better, and the team seemed stronger than ever. The only issue she was aware of was Yang constantly trying to get her to attack people. But maybe her sister was right. Maybe she needed to be a little more aggressive. If she couldn't even get past Crow's more inexperienced form, how would she ever get past anything else? "No," she thought to herself with a shake of her head. "I don't need to risk hurting people to stop them." "He didn't make a mistake," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "Then show me." It was his turn to go on the offensive. He rushed forward with incredible speed, his scythe trailing behind him. Determined to show him that she didn't need to be vicious in fights to win, she spun hers to deflect his leaping attack and brought it around in a clean arc, aiming low to take out his legs. He hopped over it though, his scythe already beginning to pick up momentum. Not wanting to fall behind, rolled backward and used the motion of getting to her feet to kickstart her own. Flashes of red, black, and silver filled her vision as their weapons clashed around them. Blades of grass were torn up as deep grooves were carving into the field. Shot after shot rang out loud and clear, each one deflected and filling the air with powdered dust which were occasionally ignited again by the sparks that flew from their weapons. With Crow on the offensive, she opted for a more defensive stance, rotating her weapon the opposite direction so that she could have the advantage. Though Crow had longer reach and more power, Harbinger's curved handle delayed his attacks by half a fraction of a second that her straight handle could easily take advantage of with its stronger emphasis on speed. After what felt like a full minute of clashing though, and building up her advantage, she finally created enough of a gap between her attacks and Crow's that she was able to easily predict his next. Bringing her weapon down as he struck his upwards, she managed to hook his blade with her own, linking the two heads together. Activating her semblance and firing off a shot, she dragged him backwards to throw him off balance. Unfortunately, he wasn't as effective as she hoped and stayed on his feet. Wanting to keep her advantage though, she kept their weapons linked and began a second exchange. It was much more dance-like than the first. Neither of them seemed to want to break the link, so guided each other around. When he pulled her close and struck out with his fist, she ducked below it and slipped between his legs, dragging their weapons with her and flipping him. When she tried to stab the tip of Crescent Rose into the ground and spin in place to slam her feet into his face, he would catch her ankle and throw her. Each time they tried to throw each other, they would manage to recover and continue the dance. Again, she felt the frustration begin to creep up. Why couldn't she just break through? Just once would be enough to prove she was right. "Ruby!" Crow growled angrily, pulling her towards him again only for her to pedal burst backwards. "Stop holding back!" "No!" She saw it too late. She'd landed in a patch of dust powder that had drifted to the ground, and Crow wasted no time firing a shot into it. Fire and electricity surged around her, pain rushing through her body as she was blasted off her feet and into a tree. Given no time to recover, she sensed Crow's approach and raised her side, just in time to block the strike from his sword. The weight of it pushed her back against the tree hard enough to hear the lumber creak, but he didn't let up. "You think you can be a huntress by being passive?" The annoyance in his tone was evident. "That you can save anybody if you never do what needs to be done?" Crow had never acted like that, never said those things before, but Yang had. Never so bluntly, but she had been trying to get her to stop holding back lately. Finally it clicked. Yang had gone to meet him yesterday. She'd shown up at the dorm room with him and told her they were all having dinner together. A dinner that Crow had forced a carb-heavy meal upon her and told her they were training. Her sister had planned it all. "I want to help people," she groaned in denial of his words. The pressure Crow was exerting growing and causing her to lose her breath. She needed to act fast. "I don't want to hurt them." Summoning her strength and knowing Crow was using enough pressure to keep her upright, she raised her legs and pressed them against the tree. Activating her semblance, she forced her legs backwards and managed to exert enough counter-pressure to push him away slightly. With a small opening available, she pushed herself off properly, hearing the tree shatter to splinters behind her as she flew into the air. Before she could get too far away, however, she felt something snag around the bolt of Crescent Rose and was suddenly dragged back down. She barely had time to make out Harbinger's blade slung around the bolt before a fist collided with her face. If there was one thing wielding an incredibly heavy side did, it was build up an incredible amount of strength. The punch felt like a missile colliding with her cheek, the sheer power of it enough to rival Yang's. Forceful enough that she bounced off the hard dirt and skidded a few feet, finally coming to halt facing her uncle and feeling her aura flicker. "Then you'll fail," he said half-shouted, pulling his sword from what was now just a tree stump. "Innocent blood will be on your hands because you weren't able to do what was needed." He paused, his eyes falling onto her. "Just like it was on Summers." Even though she knew he was trying to rile her up, that didn't prepare her for what had just been said. Crow's words hit her harder than the punch she'd just taken. Her mother had been an expert huntress, maybe even one of the best. People may have died occasionally, but it would never have been her fault. The blood would never have been on her hands, and for him to even insinuate such a thing was wrong. Her mom had been good. Great even. She didn't remember much about her. She was too young when she died after all, but she knew enough to know how good a person she was. And she absolutely would not let anyone ruin that image for her. Not even Crow. After all the stories he had told her though, how dare he say such a thing? And how he could just stand there so straight-faced like he hadn't just insulted a dead woman. A dead woman who spent every day of her life protecting people. A woman who was his former leader, that he was supposed to have loved and respected. A woman who meant the world to her. Feeling anger broiling in her stomach, she stabbed her side into the ground and pushed herself to her feet while looking him in the eye. If he wanted her to not hold back, then she wouldn't. Her arm swung aside behind her, prepping to propel herself at the man. She hated going all out, but if that was what it would take to stop him bad-mouthing her mother, then she would do it. With a squeeze of the trigger, she shot forward so fast that the world around her turned to a blur. "That's bet." "Ah!" His sword swung out towards her body, but she slipped to the side easily enough. Hearing Harbinger transform behind her, she jumped just in time to see the side slip past her feet. Feet that she slammed into Crow's stupid face. Using it to launch herself, she twisted mid-air, swung out in a clean arc, her side glancing off of Crow's. Letting off another shot the moment the barrel landed behind her so that she rocketed towards the ground. She landed at his feet too fast for him to react, the impact shattering the hard dirt. Without a second thought, her thumb found the switch and flipped it. Crescent Rose whirred to life in her hands, the serrated edge revealing as she fired off another shot to coat the savage blade. The sound of rumbling echoed behind her, as the tip of the blade raked through the dirt. She could already see Crow was in motion, but she knew at least some part of her attack was guaranteed to make contact. So following through on her attack, she brought it up in a graceful slash, dirt and fire spraying everywhere, a mix of red, orange, and brown. She heard a small grunt just before Crow leaped out of range though, and knew the fire must have clipped him. Not letting the motion die, her arms kept the blade in motion as she advanced. Everything turned to fire as she whirled her scythe around, the air around her heating to the point where she could feel it on her skin. She smelled smoke from the piles of wood that were lit aflame, smelled the vegetation burning up around her, but she didn't stop. Crow was already responding in kind too, his blade flashing silver and sending gold sparks into the air as they clashed, only for them to be lost in the fire. "Just like your dad." Crow's voice was barely audible through the crackling of the fire and the clanging of steel. "So much anger." "Shut up," she yelled back. She was done with him insulting her parents. Just as she had before, she felt her rotations begin to outpace his. Slipping her blade back around his, she fired off another shot that he pirouetted to dodge. While he managed to dodge the bullet, the dustle activated and coated her blade in electricity. Crescent Rose was designed to handle such a thing, of course, but Harbinger wasn't. Blue sparks ran up the handle, and she saw her uncle's body seize up a little. That was her chance. Though she hadn't been able to do it earlier due to having the wrong blade out, she could now. With the edge of Crow's side trapped between the serrated teeth of the new blade, she twisted her body away from him and used her shoulder as the pivot point. With the handle resting across it, she pulled down. Just like Crow, she too had more strength than people would assume, and the man was lifted into the air. She dragged him overhead until he finally slammed into the ground in front of her, at which point she slipped her weapon free. He was already in the process of getting up though, so gave it a spin, the butt of the blade crashing into the bottom of his chin. As he tumbled backwards, she felt Harbinger slip around her waist and drag her forward. Using the momentum of his roll, he rose to his feet and slammed his fist into her gut. Her breath left her for a moment, but she wasn't given any time to recover as the scythe collapsed back into sword form and struck her across the chest with enough force for her to fall backwards. She knew her aura wouldn't withstand another hit. "One hit left, kid," he called, the humor back in his voice. It didn't stop her being angry at him though. It didn't stop her wanting an apology. Devising a quick plan, she spun in place and shot off a few balls of petals. It didn't matter where they landed, they just needed to cover her. As they exploded, she heard a gunshot ring out and dodged to the side, just in time as a shot of pellets flew past her ear. A few more shots rang out afterwards, and she used her semblance and darted between clouds to stay obscured. Unfortunately for Crow, she knew how many shots Harbinger held at once. Counting them out as she bounced between clouds, she waited for the seventh. Finally, she heard it. That was her chance, and she seized it. All she needed to do was pin him, then she would get her apology. Sending one last surge of petals out over the field to distract him, she sprinted out and raced at her uncle. Her distraction had worked and Crow was looking away from her. Putting on a final burst of speed and feeling her aura threaten to give out, she twisted her scythe in her hands. Unfortunately, mere feet from her target, he chose that moment to turn and his sword came around with him in a vicious strike. It slid along her stomach and across her side, and she felt her aura break at the last moment. Real pain shot through her as the very tip of the blade slashed through her skin, but she didn't care. It wasn't deep. She knew a deep cut when she felt it. He was mid-motion and wouldn't break out of it before she caught him. So continuing with her plan, she ran past him and brought the head of her scythe up to allow the space between the back teeth and handle, where her feet would normally go, to slam into his throat. Before he could do anything to back away, she flipped the switch to transform Crescent Rose back into its sniper form. She prepared for such an occasion. With so many gears and small parts, she was always ready for things getting stuck and jamming it up, and just as they should have, her failsafes kicked it. The gears grinded to a halt as the teeth closed around the back of his neck, trapping her uncle like a pole collar one would use on wild animals. Angling the handle downwards, she pulled the trigger again. Her arms threatened to buckle without aura to protect her from the force her gun produced, but she held on as Crow was dragged backwards, and the blade on the end of the handle drove itself deep into the ground, leashing him there like a dog chained to the yard. Turning around, she looked at her uncle, his fist pulling at the teeth trying to get them to release him and failing. She knew the failsafe would hold. It was designed to withstand strong impacts after all, so quickly walked around to his front and looked down at him. "See, you can go all out without her." Apologize, she demanded. For what? He groaned and pulled at the tea some more. For what you said about Mom. Crow chuckled, and a wave of annoyance rushed through her. How could he laugh at her after saying such a thing? For the truth? It's not the TR. As she raised her foot to stomp on the ground, she was cut off by the sound of whirring greeted her ears. To her shock, the failsafe failed, and the head of her weapon expanded back into scythe form. In an instant, Crow was on his feet, and a hand landed on her hip, securing her in place as Harbinger was whistled through the air. At the very last second, it stopped, the edge of the blade pressed against her neck. Yes, it was. Summer would have told you the same if she saw this, Crow said, no anger in his voice. That's what made her better than anyone I knew. She embraced her failures and learned from them. Ruby felt the hand release her and stepped back, looking up into her uncle's eyes. She'd never been so angry at him before. She'd never been that angry at anyone before. She didn't understand how he could ever think her mom would have said such things. Her mother had been kind and considerate. She would never have said such horrible things just to try and hurt someone. And for him to think she would show just how little he knew her. Feeling tears well up in her eyes, Ruby shouldered past the man and stormed off into the woods, grabbing her scythe as she did. She had no idea where she was going, but so long as it was away from Crow, it would do. Watching her sister disappear into the tree-line, Jan let out a groan and pushed herself off the bench. She'd watched the fight from afar just like everyone else, making sure she wasn't seen. She'd seen Ruby go from restrained to released, and heard the words that Crow had used to encourage her. And she wasn't impressed. It seemed she was alone though, since as she pushed her way through the crowd, she heard the people around her talking about what they'd just seen. Beat a signal teacher. Nah, he totally won. Put up a hell of a good fight though. Never thought she was that good honestly. Always seemed weak. Definitely asking her to spar sometime. She had no idea who was talking, but she knew they had to be in a different part of the crowd because everyone near her was too busy moving out of her way with worried looks. She knew why, of course. Even with her eyes on Crow, she could still feel the telltale prickle of heat around her body, see the shining strands of hair that hung down in front of her face. When she was finally free of the throng, she strode quickly over to her uncle. It didn't take her long to reach him. Hey! He turned around, and she didn't hesitate. Her body twisted at the hip, and her fist flew freely, finding its mark on Crow's cheek. It held enough power that it knocked him off his feet, and sent him tumbling across the ruined ground until he landed a few feet away. I said be gentle with it. With a groan, he slowly stood to his feet and massaged his jaw. I ask you for one thing, and you find a way to fuck it up, just like always. I told her what she needed to hear. He brushed off one of his pant legs, but gave up halfway. How on remnant did she need to hear that our mom failed as a huntress? Because she did. Multiple times. He sighed and ran a hand through his hair to straighten it. She wasn't perfect, Yang. You think I don't know what you were talking about? She fumed in return, taking a step forward. That's what Ruby believes, not me. Exactly. And that's the problem. We've all let her think Summer was an angel, a world-renowned huntress, and told her nothing but the good. Let her believe that Summer always tried to find a way to help people, and would never have hurt someone. That is the image Ruby has, that is what she looks up to, and that is what's holding her back. Yam glared at her uncle. She knew his words were true, but she didn't want them to be. That image was all Ruby had of Summer, the only thing left of a woman she'd never really known. She didn't want that tarnished. But much to her annoyance, Crow was right. So long as Ruby was seeing Summer that way, she wouldn't be able to fight without hesitation. However, none of that mattered if they didn't find her. Thankfully though, the woods she walked off into rarely had any grim, so her lack of aura wasn't really a concern, but she was still not willing to let her sister wallow alone. So with a deep breath, she shook her head and walked towards where her sister had disappeared. Whatever. Let's just go find her, she growled, slamming her shoulder into his as she passed. Asshole. Sat with her back against the hard stone of an ancient monument, one of many that littered Beacon's grounds, Ruby used the sleeve of her top to wipe away the moisture from her eyes. It had been half an hour since the fight, since Crow had said those things, and they still hurt. Crow had never been like that before. Sure, he could occasionally be a little moody and quiet, but he'd never been so cruel. He'd never badmouthed her mom. In fact, he'd always done the opposite. Her entire childhood had been filled with stories of how good of a woman her mom was, of how innocent people came before everything else in life, even taking precedence over being a mother. Crow had talked on how Summer had never been able to give up being a huntress, that giving it up would have destroyed her because she was just as much a huntress as she was a mother. She remembered the countless tales of her missions that Crow and her dad would tell her regularly. She remembered always asking for another, and being eager for the next visit from her uncle, because it always meant that another story of her mom would come with it. And that seemed to be true this time too. But she wasn't sure if she wanted to hear it. She certainly didn't think Crow would make something up to hurt her, nor that he would tell her Summer would have said the same if it wasn't true, but the alternative meant that there were things she didn't know. Stories they had purposely kept from her. Stories that could ruin the only idea she had of who her mom was and turn her into someone she didn't know. Maybe someone that she couldn't even like. No. Nothing could stop her from loving her mom. Whatever Crow had been talking about, nothing could change that one simple fact. Ruby loved her mom, and she always would. But that image people had given her was important. It had helped form who she was. So if that changed, would she? Ruby? The sound of her sister's voice brought her out of her thoughts. Looking up from her knees, she saw the blonde walking through the trees a short distance away from her. Her head was swinging back and forth, glancing out through the forest until the lilac eyes finally landed on her. Relief filled them as she walked calmly over. Finally! The blonde walked over and motioned towards a nearby stone. Giving a nod, Ruby watched her sister sit down and give her a soft smile. You okay? She gave another nod. She was happy Yang had come to find her, but Yang had also probably been the one who asked Crow to help her. It seemed the brawler was thinking along the same lines too, since she let out a slow breath and shook her head. I'm sorry, Rubes, she said quietly. I shouldn't have pushed this on you. She remained quiet. You have your own way of fighting, and I have mine. Maybe I should just ACC. You were right. Her words came out as more of a mumble than anything, but she knew they were the truth. During the entire fight, she'd slowly been getting more and more frustrated. Not from just how Crow talked about her mom, but also from how little she'd been accomplishing. Fighting against her friends was fun, letting her feel like there was no pressure. But Crow wasn't a friend. He was family. He was the man who taught her how to fight. And he was a huntsman that she also looked up to. The only real one she'd ever actually known since her dad had stopped for a while after her mom died. Being unable to do nothing to the man who trained her, whose fighting style she knew like the back of her hand, had been more than a little annoying. And there was the fact that when she stopped holding back, she had finally broken through his defense and even pinned him. As angry as she'd been at him, she'd still been in full control. Her movements had been just as precise as the day she'd taken her test to enter Signal Academy, even more so in fact. There had been no accidents, as tended to happen around Crow specifically, no mistakes. And more importantly, it had felt good. It felt good to be fighting without the constant worrying and extra thought about how she would have to pull her attacks. Instead, she'd been able to focus on creating her own openings and overpowering her opponent. Oh! Yang reached down to pull up a few blades of grass. You want to talk about it? Ruby stayed silent for a second, thinking of her answer. She wasn't quite sure how to put what she felt into words, so chose what she felt was the easiest. Coco was right. She grumbled into her knees. I've been holding the team back. It was Yang's turn to not reply. Turning to look at her, Ruby saw conflict in her sister's eyes. It only lasted a few seconds though, as it cleared the second lilac met silver. Maybe a little, but we were never annoyed about it, Rubes. We knew you didn't like fighting people. It's not just that. She shook her head. I keep trying to be a good leader and show that you can all trust me to make the calls, but I've never trusted myself. I've always been worried I would hurt someone, that I wasn't skilled enough, or that I don't belong here. How can you, Weiss or Blake, trust me if I don't trust myself? That's kinda why we do. Ruby looked up in time to see her shrug. Well, that's why they do. I trust you cause you're my sister. But Weiss and Blake don't expect you to be the best, Ruby. They know you're still learning, but they can see how much effort you put into everything. Even if you don't fight people properly, you still make sure we train like we should. So why were you pushing me? Because you're going to get yourself hurt. The reply didn't come from Yang, but from a male voice behind them. Or someone else. Crow, Yang growled. Ruby turned her head slowly to see her uncle leaning against a nearby tree with a depressed look on his face. Though she was still annoyed at him, she had no desire to yell at him or insist he apologize like she had earlier. "But that's not your fault, kiddo," he breathed and walked over to the ruins. He shooed a raven away that had been sitting on a stone slab and sat down. "It's mine." Ruby's head turned away from the bird as it landed on a nearby branch and looked at her uncle. There was a sadness in his eyes, a sadness she'd seen only when he was drunk. Like he was remembering something he would rather not. "Summer always used to say that the first lesson a hunter should be taught is what happens when they fail. I failed to teach you that." He let out a sad sigh. "I failed her." "That doesn't sound like Mom," Ruby said with no small amount of confusion. "Why would she think that?" To her surprise, Crow looked towards Yang. Following his gaze, she saw that her sister's eyes were red as she glared back. Knowing that something was being kept from her, and that Yang was likely the reason Crow wasn't talking, she gave her sister a pleading look and watched the red turn back to lilac. After what felt like a minute, the blonde turned her head away with an almost imperceptible nod. "Fine," she muttered, snatching a branch from the ground before standing up and walking over to a nearby tree. "Just tell her. Only if she wants to." "I do," Ruby interrupted before he could finish. She hadn't been sure earlier, but knowing something was being held from her would be more unbearable. Pale red eyes connected with hers, and he bowed his head a little. After a minute of silence to collect his thoughts, he let out a low hum and started his story. "You're more like Summer than you might think," he said slowly. "When we first started Beacon, she was more dedicated than any of us. Ty just liked to fight. Me and Raven had our own reasons. But your mom, she was all about saving everybody she could. She seemed like the perfect leader for us, someone who gave your dad some direction and made us all look at things differently. But she wasn't perfect. She was a bit of a brat and got into her own fair share of mischief, earning a few of her own detentions. But it wasn't until our first mission, though, that her biggest flaws started to show. She was too kind. We were helping out the Vale Police Department, and every time we were called to action, she would try to talk them down instead of attacking them. Most were low-life thugs who didn't want to fight us because they knew they would lose, so they came peacefully more often than not. Those who didn't, well, me, Raven, and Ty took care of them. We didn't think anything of it at first. She was just being Summer. After that, we mostly took grim missions, and when we didn't, we helped the police. Towards the end of our second year, though, we went to the relay office to ask about another mission. While we were there, they received a distress call from a nearby village that was being attacked by bandits. Just as our luck would have it, most of the huntsmen were defending the wall, and the ones that weren't would have taken an hour to get there. So of course Summer offered to help, and after a call to Ashbin, we left to help. Crow paused for a breath, shaking his head as he did. When we got there, the entire village was on fire. Bandits swarmed every house, and we were outnumbered 10-1. With all that panic, we'd already seen Grim running towards it as we flew over. We needed to act fast, so Summer had us split up. We should have stayed, though. We had always just assumed Summer never fought because she knew the street thugs would have no chance, so considered it unfair. We thought in an actual combat situation, she wouldn't show that much restraint. We were wrong. 2 of the bandits were a pair of twins whose semblance allowed them to share aura to heal each other. Because of that, they fought without using it, and Summer refused to fight them because she didn't want to hurt them. She kept trying to talk them down, trying her best to make them stay down without seriously injuring them, but they would just keep attacking and healing each other. Eventually, though, we arrived to help, but she took too long. By the time we dealt with them, the bandit leader they'd been protecting had already killed a man and his child. Ruby stared at her uncle in horror. She couldn't imagine being in that scenario. Fighting 2 people who refused to raise their aura meant that it was very likely one would get hurt, but if she didn't, then others would get hurt. But even still, even with that knowledge, she failed to see how that was her mom's fault. "The bandits did that," she tried to say in defiance. "Not her." All she received was a shake of his head. "No, Ruby. It was some." "No, it wasn't," Ruby said angrily, not seeing how Crow could blame her mom for the actions of bandits. "The bandits were the ones who killed him. And Summer could have stopped them." Crow's voice was loud in impatience, silencing her instantly. She was better, stronger, more experienced. She should have been able to handle that situation without any effort on her part and save those people, but she held back. They died because of her failure to act, and she acknowledged that. Ruby looked down at the ground, her denial disappearing. It was hard to deny what had just been said. While some bandits were definitely strong, none of them should have been a match for a second-year Beacon student. "That was her awakening, Ruby," Crow said, his voice returning to its usual patient gravel. "She learned what happened when she failed, and afterwards she understood that she couldn't let it happen again. She used it to make herself better." Clearly finished with his story, Ruby looked down at her knees. She wasn't quite sure what to make of the story. On one hand, she still failed to see how her mom could be blamed for those deaths. Sure, she had failed to save them, but she shouldn't have had to save them at all. Bandits should not have been attacking people, and definitely should not have been taking lives. On the other hand, though, she could see how her mom and Crow had learned to accept that. The horrible fact was that people like those bandits did exist, and they didn't care who they hurt, but it was their job to stop them, and her mom failed. If she hadn't have held back, then those people would have been alive. If that failure had been what made her better, what she considered to be a defining moment, was it really right to deny it? Turning to her sister, who obviously knew the story already, she looked for an answer there. Unfortunately, all she received was a nod. "Why did no one tell me?" Yang folded her arms and looked down at her feet. "All you have of Mom was that image of her being perfect." She shrugged sadly. "I didn't want to take that away from you." "You?" Ruby paused and looked from Crow to Yang. "It didn't." "It didn't?" Ruby shook her head. It was the truth. Sure, it was horrible that two people had died, that her mom had failed her mission to protect them, but that didn't change who she was as a person. It didn't change that she was an amazing mom, or a badass huntress, or even that she was someone who always chose to protect people. All it did was help her understand how her mom came to be that way. "No," she said simply with a shake of her head. She felt a strong pang of sympathy rush through her, as Yang let out a long breath of relief. "Good," she mumbled with a nod. "I'm sorry I kept it from you." "It's fine." Ruby gave her sister a soft smile and slowly stood to her feet, wincing a little from the cut in her side. Her aura still hadn't returned to heal it. "I'm glad you told me." Walking over to her sister, Ruby wrapped her arms around her waist. She hated that her sister felt bad for trying to protect the image of their mom, but she also knew she couldn't ever guess at everything the woman had done to protect her. She'd never been blind to it, but she knew at times she'd certainly been ungrateful. She didn't want to be that anymore, so tightening the hug a little, she let out a soft breath. "You don't have to protect me anymore, though," she said quietly. "I'll try to fight properly." "Just go at your own pace, okay?" Yang's arms wrapped around her shoulder. "And I'm always going to protect you." "I know." Pulling away, she looked up at her sister and received a soft smile. She had been honest when she'd said she would fight properly. It would take a little getting used to, but Weiss had said she was insulted that she was holding back, so her partner would be a great way to get more comfortable with it. Returning the smile, she turned around to her uncle. "I'm sorry for yelling at you, Uncle Crow." "No, you're not." He chuckled and leaned back with a wave of his hand. "Don't worry, kiddo. I deserved it." She chuckled nervously. He was right, she wasn't sorry. But she did understand why he'd done what he did, so walked up and gave him a hug too. It wasn't as long as the one she gave Yang, but it was long enough for a hand to pat her back. Pulling away, she saw her uncle lean to the side and check her cut. "Caught you pretty bad there, huh?" he said, reaching out to peel the split flesh apart, dropping it the second she let out a hiss. "You should go see the nurse. Infection can still set in before your aura comes up." "Aw, yeah. You coming?" "Sure." He lifted from the rock and glanced towards the tree where the raven was still sitting. "You two go ahead. I'll catch up in a minute." "All right." Taking a step back towards her sister, she gave him a nod and turned to leave the ruins. The day had certainly not been as she expected, having simply hoped it would be a friendly sparring session followed by some video games with her uncle, but she wouldn't exactly say it had been bad. It certainly sucked to have her uncle press points she knew she was sensitive about, but she knew he had good intentions, so was willing to forgive him. Though, maybe there would be a little payback at dinner. Chapter 44, Fawnus. It had been a relatively quiet day for Blake. Usually, she would be constantly distracted by the loud arguing of Weiss and Ruby, or Yang trying to get her into trouble. However, with the exception of having been woken up by Ruby leaving the bed, she hadn't seen the rest of her team for the entire day. While normally those moments of quiet would be very much welcome in short periods, Prolonged absences of her friends had begun to feel a lot more empty. She wasn't quite sure when that change had happened, but she did know that it had. That didn't mean she wasn't going to at least try and take some advantage of it though. It had been some time since she'd last picked up her pencil to draw. Partly because she'd been so busy training with her team or Xanthia, but also because for the first part of the first semester, all she could draw was him. He seemed to invade her mind whenever she attempted to sketch anything. His sword, his symbol, they'd been littered all over her notepads, and she hated it. So she'd stopped and thrown them away. However, that was before she'd really grown to love her team, before RWBY. With just how happy she'd been lately, she decided it would be a good time to try again. Thankfully, he didn't seem to be invading her mind anymore, and some success had been made. She'd started simple since it had been a while, and done a relatively nondescript sketch of Gamble's shroud. It had turned out reasonably well, and doing it had even reminded her of a few minor alterations that could be made to the sickle form. After that though, she'd moved on to sketching a few other things. Yang's symbol, a large jar of cookies, and a Queen Lancer floating in midair. It was fun, feeling her mind slowly relax as her pencil worked. And since her rustiness had faded, she was more than happy to move on to something a little more difficult. Focusing on her first date with RWBY, Blake had thought back to the story of the Ursa crashing through Yang's bedroom wall. It was easy to lose herself in shading the debris flying across the room. Yang was probably the hardest to draw. With only a standard pencil, it wasn't possible to capture how brightly the brawler shined, so it almost felt like she was doing her friend an injustice. However, just as she was about to move onto the Ursa, the dormitory door slammed open and Weiss stormed through. Though Blake felt a small bit of amusement at the sheer coincidence of real life imitating what she was drawing, Weiss clearly wasn't in the mood for such a thing to be pointed out. Her brow was furrowed in frustration, her hair filled with leaves and twigs while her dress had dirt marks all up one side. "So how was the lesson?" Blake asked tentatively, but the snowy-haired huntress didn't respond. "I take it. He almost killed us." She spat and spun on her heel, her hands raised in front of her in disbelief. How can he be so foolish? He was raised around dust. He knows how dangerous regular dust is, let alone gravity dust, yet all he does is try to show off." "What did he do?" "The dolt tried to make himself float, but instead removed all the oxygen from the area. We were unable to breathe for a good 7 seconds before I got my crystal." "Wow." Blake really did have no words. Even she knew how dangerous gravity dust was, hence why she stayed away from it. All it took was the slightest misstep, and you could find yourself choking, like her friend just had, or your spine could be crushed from a sudden increase of pressure. As strong as aura was, it couldn't protect from such a powerful natural force like gravity. It was for that reason that she couldn't exactly blame Weiss for being so annoyed. Especially since Flint definitely should have known better. Even if he had never really handled it before, it was never wise to mess around with any type of dust, even if you were an expert with it. Though some were definitely less volatile than others, and there were ways to make it safer, it was still extremely dangerous. There had been a far few accidents at the camps that often ended in missing digits. One time someone had even lost their entire arm. "What did you do after?" "Nothing less than he deserved." Weiss snarled with an air of finality, and snatched up her headphones before making her way over to her bed, as she summoned a child-sized version of her knight that sat cross-legged on the floor. Knowing that meant the discussion was over, Blake shook her head. The distraction had broken her focus, and looking down at her work, she saw just how many flaws there were. While most of the room was fine, Yang looked oddly proportioned. It wasn't a surprise since she'd always struggled with drawing people, but it did leave her feel a little disheartened. So with a sigh, she pushed the notepad away and decided to take a cue from her friend and get in some extra semblance training. Propping 2 pens up on the table in front of her, one a short distance behind the other, she cocked her middle finger back and flicked out. Stopping it just before it hit the first, she activated her semblance and let the shadow continue on. Unfortunately, it faded through both, and she let out a sigh. It was a new move she and Xanthia had been working on. The principle was basic, and not too different from sending out a full clone. By sending out her clone on a strike, she could theoretically hit people through their block by allowing her shadow to fade through, and then solidifying just before impact. Unfortunately, it required a lot of focus and timing that the full clone didn't. Too early and the shadow would be blocked, too late and the shadow would fizzle out on the opponent's aura. Either way, it would result in a waste of aura. Trying again, she reared her finger and flicked the pens again. Once again, it went straight through, and she let out a small huff. She'd managed it during training with her team, but she was still struggling. So leaning down to be eye level with them, she settled in to continue her practice. It was almost an hour later when Blake finally let out a yawn and stretched her arms. Though it had been a little difficult to get a hang of the timing, she had eventually managed to get it down. After getting the timing down, she slowly increased the amount of pins and increased the distance, as well as switched from flicking to punching. Of course, she knew it would be much more difficult in combat, but it was always good to start small. Standing from her desk, she turned around and had to suppress a small yelp. She'd completely forgotten that Weiss had summoned her knight, so was given quite a fright as she turned around to see it staring at her. Out of all Weiss' summons, the knight was the one that freaked Yang out the most. Unlike the rest of Weiss' summons, it never actually did anything obvious. Instead, it simply sat there for the most part. The thing that freaked Yang out, however, was that it had a tendency to nod or shake its head when questions were asked, as if it was actually understanding them. Of course, Weiss was still adamant that the blonde was imagining things, but Blake had definitely seen it herself too. Fortunately, when no conversation was happening, the construct usually just sat there doing nothing, so Blake easily ignored it. Glancing over to the owner as she made her way to the couch, she saw the girl sitting up with multiple projections in front of her that she was swiping lazily to the side as she typed away on her scroll. Not wanting to interrupt her work, Blake sat down and let out a small sigh from the comfort. "You're getting better." The voice surprised her, but a quick turn of her head showed Weiss had pushed one of her headphones aside. Coming from a girl whose semblance was all about fine control, Blake was more than happy with the compliment. "Thanks," she replied. "Didn't know you were watching." "You're my teammate." The girl shrugged and pulled her headphones completely off. "But you're also an opponent. It would be stupid for me not to watch you practice." "Fair enough," she said and leaned back into the cushions. "So what are you working on? SDC stuff?" "No," Weiss replied a little bitterly. "I've been locked out of that database because I continue to refuse to take father's calls. This is my own personal research. Here." With a few taps of her scroll, the holeviewer they used to watch films turned on, and Weiss swiped one of the files over. A picture of an ice dust crystal appeared in the middle of the room and slowly began to rotate. With a flick of the heiress' wrist, it split in half and one side turned into powder. Another file was swiped over, this time being fire dust, and the image repeated the process. A second later, equations and weights appeared, and the two began to merge into steam dust. "Velvet is helping me with the algorithm and tech side of it, but I figured it could be a learning tool for those who struggle with dust, which is a surprising amount of people." "Not bad," Blake hummed genuinely. Despite dust being one of the oldest resources on Remnant, many people were still clueless on the finer details of it, especially vacuans, who tended to avoid dust for the most part after the kingdom had been left ravaged by the other kingdoms relentlessly mining for it. Others were simply turned away by the complexity of it, favoring the ready-made bullets that could be purchased from stores. "Are you gonna pitch it to your dad?" Weiss let out a snort of derision, a rarity from her. "If I want none of the credit, sure. Besides, this is just a fun thing I'm doing." "Fair enough." She'd learned long ago not to question what Weiss deemed to be fun. "So you're avoiding your dad?" "MHM." Weiss hummed and turned the holeviewer off to resume her work. "Though I suppose avoiding a parent makes me perfect for this team." Blake didn't miss the pointedness of the remark, but she couldn't exactly say the heiress was wrong. 3 members of the team did seem to have one thing in common, and that was that they each had difficulties with their parents. "Unlike me and Yang, however, you have no real reason to be avoiding yours." "It's not that simple, Weiss." "Except it is." Weiss sighed and turned on her bed to sit on the edge. "How many times do we have to tell you that your parents will not care that you chose to follow Siena's side of the White Fan over your father's?" Blake's head snapped to her friend. She had never once mentioned that her father was once the leader of the White Fan to Weiss, and there were only 2 other people at the school who knew. And she was pretty certain that neither Ruby nor Yang would have said anything either. In fact, she had specifically told them not to. Blake was really happy that Weiss had chosen to move on from her past affiliation with the organization, but had always been a little worried that decision wouldn't hold if she ever found out about Gyra. "My dad's side-o." "I have never insulted your intelligence, Blake, so please do not insult mine." "Sorry," she muttered, seeing no reason to lie anymore. If Weiss was still talking to her after finding out, then she was hardly going to stop now. How did you find out? Do you really think I just moved on from you being an ex-terrorist? Weiss stood to her feet and walked over to the window, the little knight shaking its head. Blake knew the girl had definitely not just moved on. While no argument or heated exchange had taken place after that moment, it had definitely taken a while for their conversations to pick back up. She'd always been a little curious about what had made Weiss finally begin to open up to her again, but had never wanted to bring up that topic for fear it would set their relationship back. When I found out what you were, I did my research and found out that the old leader was a man named Gyra Belladonna. It didn't exactly take much in the way of logical reasoning to assume you were his daughter. Blake stood up too and made her way over to the window beside her friend. Why didn't you say anything? It wasn't important. Weiss shrugged. At the time, at least. Blake shoots the girl a confused look. Have you not read anything of what your father has preached since he stepped down? She hadn't. In fact, just like most things to do with her parents, Blake had avoided pretty much all of it. She didn't even know how they were doing on Menagerie. Whether they were still together, if they had another kid, if her dad was still chieftain. They were all things she had purposely kept herself away from. What had started as her not even wanting to know those things out of anger had turned into her own little punishment for throwing everything she'd been given back at him. No. Well, you should, Weiss said. A lot of what he talks about is the intoxication of violence. About how it's easy to fall into it because it feels like you are doing something big, but stresses that he hopes one day those people will understand that there is a better way. A more peaceful way. Weiss' blue eyes flicked towards Blake. Sound familiar? I guess, Blake grumbled, knowing Weiss was talking about her. Look, Weiss sighed and turned around to lean against the bookshelf that sat below the window. I'm not going to pretend I completely understand the issue with you and your parents. Yours, mine, Yang's. They are all different situations. But I will say that with everything I read, I honestly do think your father would be more proud of you now than he was before you left. A hand was placed on her shoulder for a brief moment, radiating warmth as the bracelet on Weiss' wrist glowed red. Understanding that her friend was trying to be comforting, Blake gave her a small nod and turned back to the window. The fact that Weiss would still go out of her way after how her actions had impacted the heiress' life was a testament to how Blake had chosen the right path. She'd turned away from violence and trusted in love instead, and that had helped her find a family that included someone she would have never thought possible for her to even like. Hey, Weiss, she said quietly, feeling the girl turn around behind her. I don't I ever actually said it, but I'm sorry for the part one played in making your childhood more difficult. Silence fell between them for a second until Weiss cleared her throat. My father's actions are his own, but thank you. I too am sorry for the part my family and the SDC has played in the Fauna's suffering. Blake gave her friend a small nod, and after a couple of seconds, heard the girl return to her bed. Maybe that was the core of her dad's lessons. She did remember how he had once talked about how for things to change, people must be open to it. For Faunas to be treated fairly, they must act as equals so they can be seen as equals. And had Weiss not changed after seeing her as equal? Sure, those nasty parts of her upbringing still lingered, but there was no doubt in Blake's mind that Weiss would never pass along those beliefs to any child she may have in the future. But the White Fawn's current actions only pushed people away. It only made people like Weiss' father, or Weiss herself, push back harder. Only added validation to people who called them barbarians. Looking back, she couldn't believe she'd been so foolish as to think violence was actually an answer. With the conversation over though, and Weiss having already returned her headphones to her ears, Blake let out a small breath and slowly returned to the couch. Closing her eyes, she leaned back and tried to enjoy the music that was still playing. Something about indie rock has always relaxed her, or at least normally it did. This time, however, she couldn't stop her mind from wandering to what Weiss had said about her dad's speeches. Pulling out her scroll, Blake typed in the link to Menagerie's news network, which most people who lived there had simply taken to calling Fanews. Her dad wasn't on the homepage though, so she hesitated a little before scrolling down. Her curiosity got the better of her though, and she swiped down a few times. It didn't take long to find something regarding her dad, and she knew it was him before his wild mane of black hair even finished scrolling into view. A small smile pulled at her lips as a mix of emotions ran through her. He looked older than she remembered him, though not by much. There were definitely a few more wrinkles next to his bright yellow eyes. He was still very much the same though. Still a kind-looking man in the body of a giant swathed in a purple cloak. And he was doing well, and the sight made her feel more relief than she ever thought it would. But that was all she needed to know. Before she could close the device, however, the headline caught her eye. Chieftain Belladonna quells concerns regarding human/faunus relations, visit to Vale. The title alone made Blake's mind race with the prospect of being closer to him than she had in years. And with that knowledge, she knew it was impossible that she would be putting the scroll down without reading the article, so pulled her knees up to her chest and settled in to read.
And that's all for today. Thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.